The work that I created was the streets of your town, and it's a gouache piece on brown paper, and it kind of revolves around Suburbia, I guess the place that I grew particularly fond of in lockdown. The street actually doesn't exist, kind of a amalgamation of different parts of Melbourne suburbia that strike me as familiar. Kind of like the Google map perspective. A full streetscape kind of gives you a sense of suburbia as a whole and not just household structures. The hard rubbish, I thought that was like a massive part I had to involve because I think it's really strange. There's a week where people air their garbage to the whole suburb, and you can kind of get a sense of who's living inside these facades. I am a fan of Rick Moore, the artist. And there's a distinct lack of people in his artworks as well, and I think it's kind of eerie. It makes people just pay attention solely to the ordinary, which was the massive theme of my folio. The starting point's going for walks with my dog, which was kind of all I did during lockdown because there wasn't much else to do. I guess I paid a lot more attention to where I was walking and the people around me when I wasn't allowed to go anywhere else. I wouldn't take pictures of the houses because that felt a little bit creepy doing that, so then I'd go onto Google Maps and look at them from that way. I spent so long on Google Maps trying to scan and find a perfect image of a power pole because they'd be on the side because the car moves as they take photos. And I remember finding a street in Northgate that had the perfect, one address that had the perfect power pole in the middle, and I was like, I'm gonna use that. So just that power pole and the mattress that leans on it is probably my favourite part. Conceptually, probably Howard Arkley. I was very inspired by his suburban vernacular explorations and how he would take real estate pictures and kind of reinvent them in a vibrant and patterned way. Music was definitely a big inspiration as well because I would often listen to music when I was painting, and Streets of Your Town is obviously the title of the work. The artist is obviously trying to prompt people to pay attention to what's going on. Just choosing the ordinary as a topic, I knew that suburbia was definitely going to be a part of that, but I went from interior still life and kind of exploring inside the house, and then suburban structures, and then hard rubbish as a concept. I've found creating this artwork actually quite difficult because of the material of the really thick brown paper, because it had a really low absorbency. The paper would warp as I was painting on it. It was a bit unideal compared to a normal standard watercolour paper. I guess my general process was to pencil general shapes in and then go in with a small paintbrush and do fine details. If I could give advice, it would probably be to choose a topic that you can expand upon a lot in ways that interest you. So the ordinary doesn't seem like the most exciting topic, but for me I used that and I kind of twisted it to suit my interests and really explore things that I enjoyed, and also having fun with it. I feel like you create your best artworks when you're not stressing about being perfect. There were definitely moments when I was making this work and many of the trials in my folio where I thought this is horrible, but that was because I was looking for perfection, whereas if you're not looking for perfection, you often get your best pieces.
So the title of my work is Coexistence. It's an installation, and I aim for it to represent the harmonious interaction between the built environment and the natural environment. I intended for it to represent sort of a tranquility as opposed to the destruction or the discords that could be caused between that relationship. Essentially, they're stoneware, earthenware, ceramics. They're geometric forms, and they also contain a natural object, so a natural found object, a stone or a piece of driftwood or stick. Some other works that I did produce as well include actual moss that I grew in my own backyard. I'm a mountain biker, so I spend a lot of time in nature, on the trails, in the environment. So I really just have this connection with the environment, and I wanted to play on that a little bit. Another point of inspiration was observing sort of ancient civilizations, seeing how roots have actually climbed through the buildings and torn apart the infrastructure, doing what it is designed to do and reclaiming its lands. Another point of inspiration for me was contemporary Japanese artist Mineo Mizuno. He actually produced works that include moss as well, and I really was intrigued by the ephemeral nature of his works and how they were actually ever-changing. I like to work intuitively. That's why I chose ceramics. I found that it was the best art form for me to actually convey my concept. Because of lockdowns, I wasn't actually able to experiment fully with the glazes, so I just had to do what I could at school and put in as many firings as I could to perfect it to an extent. The key parts to my process were actually sketching the forms, trying to find compositions that worked really well and harmoniously with the natural object and the geometric form, and I also experimented with hand building as well. I had the idea of actually pressing in the natural object into the clay while it was still wet, and that was sort of my aha moment where I was just playing around with my materials and I found something that created a composition that I really wanted to use. My grandma has an art studio, and so she was definitely a strong influence in terms of me choosing ceramics as an art form. During lockdowns, when I was walking outside, I'd sort of scout my local area for branches on the ground or pebbles in walkways and things like that. So I did actually build quite a collection, and from that collection is where I put them up in a sketch and had a look at the composition and then chose the object from them. One of the most interesting and challenging things was working with both natural materials and the ceramics. So with my natural materials, I had to find ones that would suit the scale of my work and find a cohesive way to include them with the ceramic form. Glazing was quite a process as well, and I found that very challenging. I've experimented with dipping the glazes as well as brush-on glazes. I had to experiment with the different layering of glazes as well and firing temperatures. My advice would be to definitely experiment with different art forms and then settle with one that suits both your interests and your skills. Take photos of everything you do, any ideas, any adjustments. It can really help you inform you to convey those ideas and communicate those ideas in the final work.
The title of my work is Know Your Worth, and it acts as an effigy of myself. It's a culmination of my experiences and how others have perceived me and how I've acted due to their perceptions. It doesn't move, it doesn't function, and that is to play into the concept of being toyed with. So while it looks like a doll, no one can actually play with it, because I felt that I have put on a facade for a long time, and this is me taking my stance. Since I was 10, when I had alopecia, I lost a huge sense of who I was, because I had like auburn huge ringlets, and when I lost that, I felt like I lost who I was. But it's about owning one's physical appearance, their personality, their sexuality, their condition. In terms of my gender, I've never really felt like either or any, really. Being called a man just flies over my head, and a woman, I don't really feel like one either. I feel like I'm just me. I think we exist beyond our biological selves as well. The starting points were my own story and looking in the mirror, because that was an exercise that I did far too often. I thought, why not make this productive and make something out of it? And then this way I can separate that from me, because I always felt like I was an object, but if I physically made an object version of myself, I'd be able to view it through a different lens. People influenced me a lot in character design and character concepts. I like Takashi Murakami, who invented the genre super flat, a Japanese artist, and I really like his psychedelic and manga-inspired artwork. And Kim Jong-ji, who's a Korean artist, and he works with like 5-point perspective and interesting compositions and subject matter. It's really out there, and I really admire him for that. And he can draw anything from his mind. His visual library is so expansive. I used a 3D software called ZBrush. Using that software and a tablet and a pen connector to the computer, I was able to make the sculpture through that and then get it 3D printed. But the process felt quite natural because it mimicked how you'd naturally do it with the pencil. I did watercolor trials, I did some oil, I think, and colored pencil. I all knew that digitally those effects of the mediums and qualities could be translated. So by doing it traditionally, I'd get a better understanding, I felt. And I decided in the end to go with more of an oil and watercolor aesthetic with the digital painting, the poly paint. I still get it sometimes, but my skin gets red quite easily and I look worn out. So I wanted to put that in there. That's why sometimes around the bones and the face, it looks quite raw. I've always preferred traditional art, but having to translate those skills digitally, that was a challenge, but you don't really learn unless you challenge yourself. This piece, this doll, this figurine is like the process of metamorphosis. I felt the folio was the cocoon, and then this is the final product. I felt like I've reclaimed me, and through this I'm on show for everyone, but unapologetically. The advice that I'd give to students going into Unit 3 and 4 Studio Arts is to keep track of each other. You have to push yourself, but often through that grind and talking to other people, you would have gotten something so much more fulfilling than something that just came to you in the moment. Both are so good, but use both of those to your advantage, and the resources and people around you, they're in the subject for the same reason as you. You don't want to remain stagnant, so it's always good to go outside of your boundaries, and that's how people grow. Yeah, open up, no matter how scary it is. Like, you'll find yourself as well, because it is like a labor of love, and it's almost like a child. Like, you work on this subject for like 9 months pretty much, and at the end of it you'll have it. So pour yourself into it and treat it well and properly, and then you'll get a good child.
My work is called People Are Cocoon Weavers, whether they know it or not. My piece uses all sorts of different materials that are synthetic and also natural, and the ideas behind it are kind of that we as humans, as people, create our own cocoons, but also each other's. I had 3 sections. Each section was about 6 to 8 meters long. It took a very long time. I wrapped it all around my little brother. Then I put hoop iron around him. My exploration proposal was looking at change and metamorphosis. And so I'd been looking at butterflies for a long time and like caterpillars. We need to step out of this safety zone into our learning and our danger zone in order to grow. The weaving has kind of a lot of juxtaposition within it, things like electrical wires, and then it has natural things like bark or rose bush or something like that. Because that was meant to be like the juxtaposition there about prison and safety, but I was worried that was going to get missed, so when I added the bars, it looked far more menacing. And I chose the bush because the bush is where I felt safe, because I spend my whole life there. But then I also put it to this sound, which was, it's like tinnitus, and like when it's quiet I hear it, so I had that juxtaposition between the safety of the bush and then the horrible sound that I was always hearing. So what I wanted to do before COVID started was I wanted to weave some of it myself, but then I wanted to take the whole loom into school and get people just to come in during lunch and whatever, and I'd be there and get everyone to weave this cocoon. So it was like really looking at like a social experiment. But COVID hit, so I got my family to do it. So my house kind of became my cocoon. Process is kind of different. In short, it's called hands, feet, beat is how I was taught. And with hands, it's kind of like this. The wool or the bark or the whatever you're putting through it, you move it through the weaving that's like this, and you can move it through like this. So it really creates a texture. And then with feet, you have pedals, like an accelerator and a brake. And you just swap each time you move it through the weaving. And then the beat is when you're pulling down this bar, it's got like teeth in it, and that compresses the weaving, and then you can fold it away. Simple steps, but not easy. You
I think people get confused between simple and easy. Another thing that was challenging about it is that you can't actually see the work you've done because it's folded away. So you're kind of going from memory as to how it all relates, and if you want it to flow, it's quite challenging. Doing my folio, I was always playing David Bowie. When I hear his stuff, I always get something different out of it. Another one that inspires me would be Elana Stewie, and he does this fantastic work using bottle tops, like beer bottle tops. He connects them, and then he makes this grand scale golden drapes that hang from the walls and the roofs. He inspires me to keep on thinking and looking around. My number one advice is don't worry if your folio is messy, because you just got to get your brain into your folio, and you do that by doing it every night. So I did that every night, and it's really, focus comes from perseverance, is what I've decided. It feels like you're not going anywhere. Like if you haven't written it down, you can't see the progress you've done. So it's really just creating the work makes you feel better about doing the work. Even if it's really crappy work, getting the work in there, you can build off it. Making your exploration proposal broad is really important, I think, because your brain's going to take you on unexpected tangents, and you want that to be able to happen.
The title of my artwork is Bilingual Arabic and English Cards, and it's a set of 15 inkjet prints which function as children's playing cards. Conceptually, I was working with the idea of cultural compatibility, questioning the tension between my Middle Eastern heritage and my Australian upbringing. I was interested in Orientalism and the Western narrative that it pushed about the Arab identity, how it was constructed to beat the other. In the same way that Orientalism constructs works as historical, which are actually deceitful, I was interested in a work that could function in a similar way. So I worked with Google Translate, and I worked with subject matter from my trip to Iraq in 2019. I took these photos and I made a lot of assumptions about the narrative in the photo. A lot of this was influenced by the fact that I couldn't remember a lot, so there were often missing pieces in my memory, which is similar to the way that Oriental artists assumed and misconstrued images about a country they'd never visited. So ultimately, all the words in the artwork are false. I chose vessels of water because I thought that they were common to both cultures. Since I was looking at Orientalism, I looked at Edward Said's text called Orientalism, and I also referred to Jack Shaheen's Real Bad Arabs, which looks at the way that Arabs are portrayed in a contemporary setting in Hollywood. I was also inspired by Hua Kay's work as an artist practicing in Berlin with Kurdish heritage. He works with deconstructing the Art Institute through performance. That was really important for me because my artwork also has a performative element. They're kind of performative in the way that you have to pronounce the words. People are intrigued to try and figure out how to pronounce the words. I really like this statement that my art teacher kind of threw at me. When you learn a medium, you can relearn it. Not only was that the conceptual background for my ideas, but it was also the way that I approached my mediums, learning them and then unlearning them. One of my starting points was actually looking at this animation that my mum used to watch as a child, and it was called Sandy Bell. When I watched it for the first time, I just started crying because I felt this insane sense of nostalgia for something that I'd never experienced. It was Japanese, but it was depicting a blonde European girl, and then it was dubbed in Arabic. So I thought it was just so bizarre that this existed. I started looking at the text and incorporating my mother into that sort of animation. My practice progressed to look at bilingual rugs because I was thinking of Oriental rugs, and unfortunately I actually had a wrist injury, so my work is in the form of playing cards, but it was initially meant to be a rug. When I presented my work to other people, it was a bit surprising because I had people tell me that the work was racist or that I wouldn't get into top arts because it was just too confrontational. I never actually had an intention for how it would be received, but I was really pleased with that sort of range. I think I found COVID really challenging this year because I had the wrist injury. I had to compromise a lot of my ideas. I found myself just translating words for hours without actually paying attention to what they were and just writing them down. Well, something that really helped me throughout the year was phrasing my annotations as questions rather than statements, and that helped me build on each idea. I guess that's also why my intention isn't that clear, because it was more of an exploration than a question and then an answer at the end.
The title of my art piece is My Sister's Paralysis, and it's an installation which consists of 2 bodies and 2 pillows which have my sister's face in them, created from fine liner, which is portraiture, and plaster and bedsheet for the bodies. And it looks at the reality of sleep paralysis. When an individual is under this sleep paralysis, what they look like from an onlooker's perception versus how they feel inside. One piece is a body which is straight with a face, just a straight closed eye look, and then another body is cradled, and this is all made out of plaster, and that shows what's going on in their minds, how they are unable to move, but they feel like they need to move because they're going through this horrific state of the mind. So I wanted to show this because my sister experiences it. It's my sister's face on 2 pillowcases and 2 bodies. I always wanted to do portraiture, and I was always into drawing fine detailed drawings. So I was looking at facial expressions at first. And then my sister mentioned that she had a sleep paralysis night one night, and looking at how she felt and when she was describing this story, how it was impacting her. I initially started with fabric stiffener for the bodies to create creases and to make it look like the actual bedsheet is shown. Created 2 bodies, and then for the faces, always wanted to do fine liner. I took a lot of photos of her. I told her to recreate her facial expressions while she would be in this scene. So I just took a variety of photos and then decided to use one that was very expressive, really showed fear. I just want people to understand what sleep paralysis is more about. What is she going through? Yeah, people might be sleeping normally. They might look completely natural under a sleeping condition, but it is greatly affecting her sleep. The pillowcases I chose to do because I was at home during lockdown, couldn't use any other mediums. So I initially started off with really thick fine liners as well. After a lot of experimentation, I just decided to do the cheap pillowcases that ended up working well and the 0.1 fine liner. So it was definitely a lot of playing around, a lot of experimentation with the bed sheets, with how to dip it into the plaster, how many coats I should do with the plaster, how to transport it from home to school, to work out how to scale the face to the body, even though the body was at school and I was at home doing the face. And because of lockdown, I couldn't match them up. So there's definitely a lot of experimentation, a lot of printing out pages, photos, buying different materials. I found this artist, Tracy Emmons. She created My Bed, which is her bedroom scene. So I was definitely inspired by that to create a bedroom scene. I also love looking at smaller artists on social media and the realistic portraits that they do. I love realistic portraiture and also galleries for just the idea of the installation. Definitely my idea to create the 2 bodies rather than just the one, to have the bodies elevated a bit. Most interesting was definitely seeing my development in the drawing skills. So I started off with creating 2 major practice pieces for the faces. And then later on when I created the finals, I reflected on the practice versus the final. And it was such a big difference in the scaling, the overall detail, how realistic it looked. As cliche as it sounds, think outside the box. Try using different materials, look around what's in your house, what's in the nature around you. And if you have an idea, think about different ways to present this idea. So if you're thinking about fear, for example, think about creating an artwork that might be elevated or a taller artwork to represent the fear of heights. When you're starting off with your folio, don't think of one final that you want to create. Think of an idea, but don't think about a final image in your head at the start of this, because it'll definitely change throughout and it might limit your ideas. Definitely looking at an issue rather than a look that you want to create at the end.
So the title of my work is My Set of Escapists, and it's a 52 by 52 centimeter graphite drawing. I tried to illustrate distorted version of reality in an art museum. I wanted to make the place feel elegant yet also familiar in a sense, and I tried to incorporate paintings that reflect the personal life of the individual. Making the place feel comforting encourages the individual to sort of escape into their own sense of a safe place. My intention for incorporating birds is to convey the fleeting feeling of escapism. The birds are positioned in the foreground of the composition, and I tried to incorporate more human-like features, making the eyes a little more of an almond shape instead of a circular, because I want to forge a connection between them and the audience. My main reason for incorporating the cast is to represent the concept of loneliness. I consider them more as solitary animals. The birds are positioned in the foreground of the piece to reflect the initial comfort and the sort of facade I wanted to convey. The whole environment itself is mainly constructed by the own person's solitude. I chose pencil and paper to illustrate a monotonous look behind it. Another reason is because it's mainly the resources I have at home. I personally like to draft the title first before I tried creating the piece, because I find creating the title, I'll be able to create a vague image of what I want the piece to be or what mediums I want to incorporate and experiment with. I was mainly inspired by Massimo Colonna and MC Esch's drawings and how they created their illusionary visuals and how they create their architecture. I really like that. What inspired me to set the environment as an art museum is because of Gianni Nelson's novel titled I'll Give You the Sun. I really like how she portrays the thinking process of one of her characters by reflecting the underlying thoughts and emotions of the character through an art museum and art titles at every single passage. I found it very hard to visualize what kind of buildings or the overall structure of the piece. I tried creating a digital collage with photos I found online. I just used it as a loose reference for me to create the piece. At first, it was really structured and too realistic in my opinion, so I tried to warp it using the circular frame. Then later, illustrate it using only graphite pencils to create the overall composition. What I find the most fun is discussing my potential ideas with peers and with my teacher as well. Even if it doesn't make sense, I feel like it's better than keeping it to yourself. What I find the most challenging is changing my working schedule. I really wanted to incorporate a line of print with my actual piece, actually. It was supposed to be sort of like a film strip or a storyboard kind of thing, and I wanted to reference it where the table is, but because of time restraints, I had to cancel the idea out. What I would say to students undertaking BC art is to brainstorm your ideas ahead of time and try to make up as many ideas as you can. Try to brainstorm ideas that will be easy to produce at home and some that can be pretty ambitious or experimental you want to try out. Try to take note how other creators depict their work and how they convey their messages. You can take inspiration and apply it to your own work.
My work was titled Motherland, a poem about immigration, and it's a slam poem paired with a video that I've taken of myself and a few of my friends throughout lockdown.
Mother isn't mad. She's just disappointed. She sees your dark hair, brown eyes, olive skin, your accents out of your tongue. She slowly hears you adopt the way you speak.
It's about my experience as an immigrant and my mother's experience seeing me completely adapt to a new environment, changing and rejecting my own roots.
But Mother isn't mad. She's just disappointed.
It was created with iMovie and Premiere Pro. It also involves a personified version of my home country, so Italy. I see it as like a mother, a woman. There's a child leaving the room untidy, and that's the reason why a mother could be upset, but that is also a metaphor for someone leaving their home country with unfinished business.
You left at night and came back in the morning, missing first steps, first kisses, and your grandfather's last words. She prayed while you were on the plane.
The video involves a few home videos with my cousins, my boyfriend, my family, a few of my childhood friends, and all these videos were taken in Italy in January 2020, which was right before COVID hit my family, and part of the inspiration of the poem was looking into my guilt of knowing that my family might pass away and that I would never see them again.
The women in my family carry bruises like army pins, badges showing off their bravery flourished across the skin just like mothers.
One of the challenges of the poem was that I had to give people creative freedom because we were in lockdown. So I just sent them the script and I sent them my recording and I said, go crazy. The poem actually was a poem that I wrote in year 11. It was something that I wrote really quickly and it was kind of like a Dr. Seuss rhyme type of thing. But then I got the idea from there to go and think of like things that a mother could be upset and how to use them as a metaphor for like someone struggling with any challenge regarding immigration and that sort of stuff. I had a big phase where I would write slam poems. They weren't necessarily good, but I would write them. Definitely music is a huge thing. My family have always been into music. My dad and my brother, they're all musicians. I love cinematography, so I love Aronofsky films and I love Anna Billa as directors, so sort of get inspiration from them visually. I have a huge initial mind map and it's just a page filled with topics and subtopics and I've just added all the songs that are sort of having a playlist that I need to listen to get myself in the mood for creating, I guess. My work being video, so contemporary, I didn't really use too many things. I just had video footage, then I used Premiere Pro and iMovie to sort of tie them all together and make it really cohesive. And that was pretty much it, as in processes and materials. I love acrylic paint and that sort of stuff, and I love oil pastels. So initially I was sort of looking at creating something like that, creating like an art installation. So I completely strayed away from that, creating this project, and I just moved on to that because I did media this year, so it was sort of like all tying together with all my other interests. It was such a big thing for me to have VHS when I was little, and I would always watch it and I would just always look back at all the things, and now I can't do that anymore. But everybody else usually has them in their own house, so if only I had those old videos that I could put in there, but I couldn't, so I had to use the iPhone footage. The challenging part was getting everything to be cohesive. So I arrived in Australia when I was 12 in 2014. Everybody was really intrigued by me because I was the only kid that didn't really speak English at the time in that school. So everybody was sort of like always trying to get my attention and trying to get me to speak my own language and all that sort of stuff. And then later on, it sort of became like I had to fit in, and everybody was sort of getting annoyed because I wasn't able to speak properly and I had this really thick Italian accent. I completely hated my home country for a long time. And then later on, when I went back to Italy, it just like, I fell in love again and I loved everything about the art and the culture and I just, yeah. So the advice that I would give to VCR students would be to definitely annotate before moving on. That's one of the main things that I didn't really follow, and then I had like 20 pages to annotate. And definitely not doubt yourself. I'm someone who's very self-critical, and at one point I just sort of had to think about how other people perceive my work and not how I perceive it.
The title of my work's Potts County. It's a large-scale oil painting on canvas. I made this during the second lockdown that we had that left me craving the chaos of everyday life. And I found that through the literature I was reading, in particular Hop 1280, a book by Jim Thompson, which uses an unreliable narration to mislead the audience. The pleasant countryside kind of gives way to an underbelly of violence and betrayal and sexual cruelty, which I think shocked me because it was in such contrast to my world that had become my kind of bedroom during this time. It moved me to create this contradictory reaction of shock, but also that desire for chaos. And so I explored that in my painting through this blood red background and working into a kind of angular web of barbed lines to create an almost blatant violence that's there on the surface the whole time. I almost needed to separate myself from this action because it was so shocking in nature. So I kind of contained it in this blue border, which almost acted as if a postcard. In the foreground, I've used a softer palette of pastel colours and soft curves. I've been influenced a lot by Australian artists like Davida Allen and Mike Parr and Gareth Sampson, particularly Gareth Sampson. Those almost windows into the underpainting. My painting Theatre of the West, which I completed in Unit 3, was a definite point where I moved from my backgrounds becoming more than just plain blocks of colour into semi-abstraction that worked with the figures to further that meaning. That was a point where I started to explore that abstraction further and realised how it could be used to create meaning. Working from home was definitely interesting. I had a studio space, and that kind of allowed me to put all my time into my folio and creating the folio that I wanted. Painting itself is definitely a challenging process. You spend a lot of the process second guessing and feeling as if what you're doing is almost pointless. But like when you reach that point where you start to resolve your idea, that's probably one of the best feelings. Accessing materials was hard this year, using other equipment like manipulating photography in the darkroom and using the print press. And I think that was difficult to explore in depth as much as I wanted. Knowing when you've finished a work is probably one of the most challenging things of painting, because there's almost a tipping point where you can go too far and lose the meaning that you intended. So finalising or resolving that idea is definitely challenging. With this painting, I've done that postcard border, the dark blue, and it's frames the painting, but it also, you can step back from it and it's finished. It's that point, it's like, I need to stop now. My advice would probably just be put everything into your folio. Make that your focus, track your progression, show the work that you've been putting in. Working just from school, the time restraints can be quite limiting. So I think if you have a space for yourself at home and can kind of gather your own materials, then you can fully invest yourself in that process of creation.
The title of my work is Self-Portrait, and it is a oil on canvas painting completed with linseed oil as a medium. My aim was to construct work that examined historical art in contemporary culture, how I could create new perspectives on the past, examine contemporary issues, concerns, ideas. However, as the year progressed, I was able to acknowledge that what I truly wanted to present was my love and adoration for historical art and my pure joy of painting. So I sort of weaved myself into what I'd been doing, and it just formed into an examination of the self, my identity of an artist and my aesthetic tastes. My inspiration comes from art history. I remember going to the National Gallery as a small child. Some of my favourite artists are Artemisia Gentileschi, Caravaggio, Ingres, Jacques-Louis David, Rembrandt and Vermeer. I love about these artists their warm and like burnt colour palettes, their use of paint, how each one can tell a story. They just come together to create these powerful and emotive pieces. To create my work, I began with taking photographs, then used pencil on canvas, and I used a raw umber underpainting with a big brush to gesturally create all the darkest detail of my piece. I then went over slowly and methodically with pigment and oil, used white titanium to finish the highlights in the eyes and the nose. I then let it dry for about 2 weeks and then proceeded to do a small layer of varnish over the top. It only took me 3 or 4 days, maybe a week at tops. Doing the photo shoot was the hardest because I didn't have anyone to take my photo for me. I had a tripod set up. I have no experience with photography. I'm a terrible photographer. Basically, I took 2 photos, one where the hands were good and one where the face was good, and I actually combined them together in Procreate. I wanted to create a work that was historically accurate. I would have liked to stretch my canvas myself, but I ran out of time. I did, however, use traditional pigments. I tried to match my colour palette to the Baroque or Dutch Golden Age as best as possible, so those dark, warm, burnt tones and colours. The thing I found most challenging about creating my work was to strike a balance between the 2 worlds that I wanted to present. I didn't want to create a work that was so obviously within the historical, I had to find the balance within the contemporary as well. So in the image, I'm wearing just a plain black shirt. There's no jewellery, there's nothing to distract. It's a pure stripped down, raw expression of joy in painting. I actually had 2 finals. I began a painting previously. It was so complicated and so in depth with jewellery and clothing and all these colours. And my parents kept telling me, come on, you just keep going, you can do it. And I just eventually said no. I had to really trust my gut. So I began again and told myself that I will just make this about the paint and about me loving what I do. I found working at home to be actually more enjoyable than working at school. I needed a quiet environment. It was more enjoyable to be alone and at home as opposed to the dramatic environment that I would have been painting in. My advice to students taking Studio Art or art this year would be to choose your theme as early as possible and to have ideas written down, little sketches complete, just even do some little artworks just to see what you enjoy doing and what you don't enjoy doing. I'd also suggest getting as much sleep as possible and to choose something you are truly passionate about. There's no point in doing something for the marks or for your teacher's approval. It's more important to enjoy what you're doing, and yeah, it's the best way to succeed in VCE.
The title of my work is Unsubscribed. It is a doll form, so you can take the limbs off and even the head. You can kind of swap which side of the head that you want to show, which is symbolic of the 2 faces that we kind of have to have in society. The face that I've chosen to mostly show is quite vulnerable because I think there's a lot of power in vulnerability. The other side of the face, her senses where she can see, where she can communicate, have been stitched over. She looks a lot happier, but she has been silenced. Growing up, I had to subscribe to a set of societal norms. When I did try to follow them, they made me really, really unhappy. I figured that the best way to communicate the concepts that I wanted to was through textile art. And even though I wasn't very familiar with it and it was a little bit scary to work with, I'm very grateful that I took that leap. It kind of created the visceral presence that I wanted the doll to have. The makeup was mainly inspired by a woman I find very empowering to me, who is Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees. Originally I was looking at depicting a more traditionally feminine physique, but I chose to depict a transgendered form because I feel that people do not recognize that women are not just biologically women. Gender roles and sexuality, how you identify, it should be able to be on a spectrum. It shouldn't be as binary as just male, female. Appearances are just appearances. The materials I used were soft canvas for the body, which I used acrylic paint to do a wash, acrylic for the face as well, to do the hair and the eyes. Lots of thread, lots and lots of thread. Some felt for the mouth and the organs, which I also embroidered fine liner for the really, really tiny details. Bits of ribbon to kind of create the binding on the arms and the little velvet ribbon to piece everything together. Oh, and fake eyelashes that I put on, yeah. The main influences would be conversations that I've had with my peers about their experiences with their sexuality and trauma or any kind of pain. I'd have to say Cat Rabbit, the Melbourne artist, she is the person who really inspired me to do textile art, taking drawing and then going, hey, let's make this physical, and it just takes on its own characteristics and persona, I guess, and I really, really love that aspect. I have always been very fascinated with organs, and those organs are connected to the heart near her belly, which holds a child, a little fetus. The organs being connected to the inner child are showing that this woman is self-sustained. She's inspiring herself and she's giving herself strength. Well, take advantage of the exploration process because you literally get to make lots of different art for your year 12 and it's really fun. And even though it can feel like a lot of work, it can be hard because a lot of the time during the creative process you have an idea of what you want, and then sometimes when that isn't realized it can be quite upsetting, but it's actually quite magical if you let it unfold naturally rather than resist what it is becoming.
The work is called The Holy Trinity of 2020 Whilst Stocks Last, and it's a scathing critique of the machinations of commodification and the way that it sort of changes the way that we interact with objects. All sort of centered around these contemporary issues within the gallery. I think the one is based on war, the whole assassination of the General Soleimani and the sort of fallout that followed. And then that is all accompanied by a smattering of sort of these digitally produced sort of badges and t-shirts, which work to like flatten these ceramic pieces into sort of mere aesthetics. The one ceramic piece that's in the gallery, it's this rather crass rendition of someone who looks very familiar, wearing this vintage sort of pilot's cap, completely naked, and he's sat upon this missile firing off to who knows where. You know, it's all heavily saturated, it's garish. The whole merchandising aspect of the piece came around when I went to the NGV at the start of the year. It was the Cause exhibition at the time. I had already become sort of acutely aware of the whole exhibition through merely like the merchandising that had sort of leached out into the world and spread everywhere. These artworks had sort of become a brand in and of themselves, almost like a separate entity to these pieces. Starting points and influences stemmed majorly from everything that went on in 2020, and it's sort of the merchandising in and of that itself. The sort of capitalization of these tragic events, the bushfires, the BLM protests, the coronavirus. People inspire me. Stories about people, how people interact with stuff. I find that's intensely intriguing. People like Murakami, Kurt Vonnegut, Rosalie Ham, Alice Munro. Hugely inspiring people in terms of the way that they're able to relate human experiences into like text, into stories, into these delightfully absurd tales. They're super cool. I love them. In terms of the ceramic works, they were made of stonework clay, then were underglazed and fired accordingly. I tried to use these sort of really garish colours and display like this contrast between obviously the matte underglaze and the sort of glossy glazes, mostly because I find that stuff just fun to do. In terms of their making, I tried to sort of spontaneously as possible. I wanted them very much to be these very impressionistic capturings of my initial reaction to them, which also allowed me to lend a meaning to them in retrospect. In terms of challenging, probably the scaling down of the work, both like sort of the innate scaling that comes with sort of having to get it done on time, and then the further alterations that have been made to the work due to sort of the complications involving everything that happened during the year, and how that interrupted the artistic process. Going into the year with this sort of concrete idea of what the work is going to be is fantastic. If you're trying to mold your exploration to fit with that theme in and around it, you're going to find that you don't have a lot of wiggle room. Those distractions and tangents, they're often sort of indications of what you'd rather be doing, and it turns out that works are actually easy to make when you're having fun with them.